Wendy at Scrapbook Graphics. Today we're going to look at the Overlay Toolkit. This is a set of actions to help you apply overlays to your papers and elements. There are several different options within this toolkit to help make things easier. The first action we're going to look at is one that adds one overlay on top of a paper. So you can either have a paper loaded into Photoshop here, or you can just fill a layer with any color that you want to apply the overlay to. So we're just going to press play. We get some instructions here to have our layout or paper open, to have that layer selected in the Layers panel. Then when we're prompted, we're going to choose the overlay that we want to place on there. And press continue. If you get this message, the command set is not available, that's perfectly fine. All that means is that this was not a flattened paper before we started, so just press continue. All we have to do here is choose the first texture or overlay that we want to apply, so just go ahead and select whichever one you want and press open. And then we have a message that we can recolor the overlay or change the blending mode and those kind of things. We can also swap the order of these with one of the other actions called the overlay flipper. So we'll take a look at that in a second. Just press continue. Depending on the color that you've chosen and the overlay that you've chosen, you're going to have a little bit of a different effect. So for example, if I had chosen a darker magenta here, I'm going to end up with a much darker paper, even darker than the color I selected. And that's because of the way that the overlay is being applied to that color. You can see the difference. So you have a couple options when you're playing around with how that overlay looks. One is to just lighten the color slightly, just sort of brighten it up and fill your color layer with that, and you'll see you get a much brighter color that way. Another option is to play around with your overlay texture. So you can change the blending mode here. There's lots of different blending modes that you can use for different looks. So play around with them, get used to what they do and what you like, what you're going for. There's certainly many different options. You can adjust the opacity of it. Dragging that slider up or down will affect how much of that overlay is showing through and how much it darkens the layer beneath it. So that's another way you can adjust how that overlay looks. Another way is to actually adjust the levels of the overlay itself. So to do that, you would press Command L, and you can darken areas. You can darken and lighten the midtones, the shadows, and the highlights. So that will give you a bit of a different look as well to your overlay. If you're still not happy with what's happening to your final result here, and I find this is almost always the case when I'm using a yellow color. Let's just put a yellow color in here. You'll see it gets very green and muddy, and I really don't like that. So in this case, I would choose to use the overlay flipper. So all I need to do is select the overlay flipper action after I've already run the one paper action and press play. This says you must run the overlay one paper action first. This action will swap the overlay and the paper for a different effect. Select the overlay layer that is immediately above the color layer. So I'm going to press stop here, and that's because I have the color layer selected. I need to select the overlay layer. So that's the one that needs to be selected in the Layers panel, and now I can press play to continue. So let's go ahead and hit continue. And now our color layer is on top of our overlay layer. And what that allows us to do is play around with more of the opacities and the way that it is being recolored. So I'm going to add a white layer here at the back. You'll see here I can take the opacity of this texture down some, and I can play around with this layer. So if I choose overlay for that, going to get a little bit of a different effect than having chosen the color layer. And that can all affect how muddy that color gets when using yellow. So that is one way of handling it. Now, if you go through this and you don't like the result you got by putting the yellow on top, you can actually go back and run the reverter. And when you run the reverter, just have that color layer still selected, press play, and it's going to swap those layers right back the way we had them. Okay, so let's take a look at adding a two-paper overlay. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete this overlay. We're going to start with, let's just try a different color. Let's try a nice teal color this time. And we're going to select the two-paper action and press play. So in this case, we're going to be prompted for two different overlays. So I'll go ahead and select the same one I selected for before as the first one. And then I'm prompted for a second one, so I'll choose a different one this time. Okay, so now I have both of those effects stacked on top of each other, and I can still edit both of them. So since we're doubling up on the amount of texture that's being applied on top, we may want to brighten this color layer significantly if we're trying to work in a certain color palette. So that can be done right there. And now we have a double texture applied. This works great too if you want to apply texture and then you want to apply a border or edge effect. This is a great way to do it. All right, now we're going to look at applying a texture to an element. So for that, just have an element loaded into your layout or your file here and select the embellishment action and press play. When the action pauses, you are going to be prompted to resize that overlay. Now, I found that especially in Creative Cloud 2017, that there's a little bug. The resize handles do not appear in the action until you use your move tool and you bump up or down on that layer. So just grab your arrow key on your keyboard and press up or down or left or right, and that will end up bringing up the resize handles. So now I can resize that overlay if I choose to basically make sure it's covering the entire element, and then press enter. And I get a little message that we're done and we can adjust the opacity and press continue. So now this layer has been clipped. Let's go ahead and turn the texture off of those layers. It's been clipped to that element. And I can go ahead and play around with how that looks. Again, we can adjust the opacity. We can change it to be different mode here. We have lots of options. So that the main difference in that action is that you are clipping that texture only to the element area. Whereas down here, we're filling the entire canvas with that texture. Okay, so that's the basic difference. I'm going to go ahead and delete this texture and show you that action one more time. And this time I'm going to use a paint splat instead of an actual full 12 by 12 texture. And you'll see this works just fine too. So in this case, I need to enlarge it slightly, press enter, and press continue. And there we go. Now, I could, with this particular texture, lock it down and fill it with a color. So that's also an option. And then I can get a little bit of a different effect going just by recoloring that texture that I've loaded. Now this only works when you have a transparent texture. These textures down here, this one in particular, was not a transparent texture. It was a solid flattened JPEG type texture. If you want to convert your texture into a transparent texture first, you can run the overlay maker. I'm going to demonstrate those at the very end, but we have the overlay sizer and the overlay maker, and these work really well if you're scanning something in. So before we go there, let's just go ahead and demonstrate the very last add overlay action. And this one is designed just to work with a shape. So to grab a shape, just grab your shape tool. Let's turn that into a starburst. And let's change our color here so we can see what we're doing. And we're just going to click and draw. Okay, so there's our shape. And now we can go ahead and press play. Press continue. And let's just grab this one. And again, if we bump up or down, we can resize that and press enter. Now we're being prompted for the background color, and you can just go ahead and click OK and press continue. So in this case, we have the color on top, we have our texture here, and then we just have white on the bottom. And you can play around with these too. If you want to darken it up, you could put a little bit of gray down here, and you can mix and match the colors so you can get a different effect that way. So that's another way of adding some texture to an element or a shape. So that's how the Overlay Toolkit works. I hope this video has been helpful. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will see you next time.